What's up guys? Today we're going to talk about artifacts and how to be efficient with them. We're going to be covering what artifacts you should throw away and fodder into XP, and what artifacts you should keep for your current characters and for future characters that might come out. Basically, I've noticed a lot of people like farming artifacts and not sure what they should keep, people throwing away artifacts that have a lot of potential, and basically since I've been farming artifacts literally for like a year now, since I was AR 40 and now I'm AR 58, I have a ton of experience doing artifacts. It's honestly the main thing I do, and so I wanted to give you guys some advice. Now, a few important things before you begin. Number one, this video has a lot of information, and while I'm trying my best to structure this very clearly with some timestamps and trying to go in order, it is very hard to split everything in specific categories. So this video will have all the information you need to know, but I highly recommend you like watch it all because it might be difficult for me to like accurately split everything into sections. Also, this will be a video for basically all levels, and so you should take this information and apply it to you based on your like artifact standards and where you are in the game. And this video will be covering pretty much everything from basic information to like what stats you should be looking for to some of the more advanced and lesser known tips, like just what you should keep, what artifacts you should maybe level to +4, specific artifact stats for specific sets. So what would be good for like Noblesse Oblige versus what's good for Crimson Witch of Flames, and just everything you need to know regarding what artifacts you should keep and what you should throw away in as much detail as possible without taking too much time. So yeah, with all that being said, I want you guys to know that I stream most nights on Twitch. Link in the description if you're interested. Be sure to sub if you're new, and let's get into it. So let's start things off by going over some general information for every player and every character that we're going to use throughout this whole video and that I should get out of the way right now. First of all, as you might know, the most important stats on most characters, again, this can depend, but generally speaking, are crit rate and crit damage, as those give you the most damage on most DPS characters and even burst supports. Other than just crit, a lot of characters need energy recharge as well. They usually need a specific amount to be able to spam their burst on cooldown, especially if they're support characters or have a high energy cost burst like Eula, Beidou, Xiangling. So they usually need a specific amount of energy recharge, which can be a must and very important. Other than that, a stat like Elemental Mastery is very situational but really amazing on specific characters who will be proccing reactions like Vaporize, like Swirl if you're an emo, or Melt. Any of those reactions where you can be dealing big damage, Elemental Mastery is really good on. Other than that, the percentage stat of whatever your character scales on, which is usually attack percent, is good as a substat on a lot of pieces, but do keep in mind that characters that don't scale with attack, so a character like Hu Tao, for example, who can scale off of HP, or someone like Albedo who can scale off of defense, can want the defense percentage or HP percentage instead of attack percent, which most characters would want. Lastly, the other stats, usually the flat stats aren't that good. So flat attack, flat defense, and flat HP are usually stats that you're just never looking for. Even if your character normally wants HP, flat HP is usually just a lot worse than other substats. So this is sort of common knowledge at this point, but I didn't want to do a sort of hierarchy of stats just so we can get that out of the way for the rest of the video. Now, in terms of specific pieces, flowers and feathers are pieces that you can be very picky on, or at least more picky depending on what your standards are, because the main stats are always set. Your plume is always going to be attack, your flower is always going to be HP, so it's usually a lot easier to upgrade these feathers if you get a bad one, and to be a lot more picky with your substats, whereas other pieces like sands, goblet, and circlet can be a lot harder to get perfect. Now, another important piece of general information is to know your standards, know what point of investment you are in the game. Me, for example, since I've been farming artifacts since release, my standards are a lot higher than most people's. An artifact that might look good to you or might be good for you, I might throw away because, like, for example, I have 4 Blizzard Strayer circlets, so I can throw away the ones that aren't as good as my other ones. Now, overall, I do just recommend getting good main stats first of all, and then upgrading from there. So let's say you're trying to build a character like Klee, mine has no artifacts on, I would start by trying to get an attack percent sands, a pyro goblet, and a crit circlet. Now, since I'm trying to build this character, my standards can be a lot lower than a character I already have built, because I'm just going for, first of all, a crit damage circlet or crit rate, and then after that I'm trying to upgrade it by getting better and better substats. In terms of general main stats, circlets for most characters are crit rate or crit damage, although there can be some exceptions. For example, healers might want healing bonus or HP percent, which can be good, and Elemental Mastery circlets can also be good for characters who want to proc reactions like Swirl, or who are just elemental supports, again mainly for anemo characters like Sucrose, but generally speaking, crit is what you're looking for. On your goblet, usually an elemental goblet for whichever element you're using is the way to go. However, attack percent can also be viable on certain characters, and HP can be good for healers or shielders like Zhongli, but generally speaking, an elemental damage goblet is what you're looking for. And then for your sands, this is where it gets more complicated. Most characters want attack percent, but a lot of supports will go for energy recharge, and elemental mastery can be viable on a few reaction characters and best in slot on anemo units. Characters that are constantly swirling like Sucrose, like Venti, like Kazuha can really want elemental mastery on their sands and on their substats. substats. And lastly, characters that scale off of different stats than attack percent. And this is a general rule just on building the character in general. You can replace this attack percent with whatever they scale on. So again, for Hu Tao, that would be HP percent. And for Albedo, that would be something like defense. And while this isn't too relevant to the video, if you're wondering why some of my characters are on weird artifacts, it's because when I make videos, I move things around a lot. So ignore the fact that my Chi Chi's on defense. Another piece of general information I can give you guys regarding your standards on artifacts are actually how many substats they have at level 0. Something you might have noticed is that 5-star artifacts can have either 4 or 3 substats at level 0. And these really aren't bad, but you are missing one role with a 3-statter versus a 4-statter. So I'm actually going to level a piece for this video just to show you guys, but basically when you get this artifact to level 4, and every 4 levels it'll roll, but when you get it to level 4, as I'm sure you know, it unlocks another substat. We got flat defense here, but basically you're level 4 now with 0 bonus rolls into anything. You just have all 4 stats. Now the artifacts that started with 4 stats are at an inherent advantage because once you level them, once you get this to +4, it'll roll into one of the 4 substats. And so you can get higher stats overall if you do have 4 stat artifacts. The reason I'm mentioning this is because artifacts that have 4 substats are generally just better. And so you can be a bit more picky with your 3 stat artifacts versus your 4 stat ones, because artifacts that might look bad, that might only have 1 or 2 good substats, if they do already have all 4 at level 0, have a lot more potential. Now we're going to get into a bit more specific information. This regards what you should actually be keeping and what you should be throwing away based on you, the characters you have, the characters you want, future characters, and just all of that. First of all, you have to ask yourself what your current artifact standards are. So if you were to compare an AR 58 player versus an AR 45, 50, or even just 55 player, their artifact standards are usually going to be very different. If you are at the point where you're just building good main stats on characters and you don't really care about the substats, that's basically your first step, right? Going for good main stats on everything. Then you might want to just be keeping artifacts that have good main stats. For example, you should be sure to have elemental goblets, 5-star elemental goblets for every character that you can, every element that you need, even if the substats are completely terrible. While goblets can be really hard, for other pieces, I would recommend being a bit more picky and looking for at least crit on the substats, usually crit damage and crit rate if you can, and effectively keeping all of your pieces that have, let's say, crit damage and crit rate, because that's just generally a very good piece on literally any of the 5 slots. As a general rule, to sort of sum things up and to basically move on from the subject, is if you are very early game, so let's say under AR 50, and maybe you just started farming artifacts, or maybe you farmed from 45 to 50, I would try to go for main stats first, and then start integrating good substats in your pieces, especially flower and feather, which it's all you're looking for, usually through crit rate and crit damage, but also things like we mentioned earlier, energy recharge, attack percent, elemental mastery can all be very good. After that though, when you get to the late or end game, you can really start to min-max your pieces and start throwing away a lot more pieces that you would have otherwise or previously kept. A good example of this transition is if we look at my first Razor video, and I've made an updated one, but you can see my flower that I had. This is the one I used. It was +20 and it only rolled into crit once, right? It mainly rolled into flat attack and once into attack percent. This is a flower that at the time was amazing because I was AR like 45 or around there. But if I were to get this artifact now, I 100% would have thrown it away. I actually don't even have it anymore, but at the time it was definitely an amazing piece. And so it really depends. The stats you're looking for can highly depend on what AR you are and what your standards are. With that being said, I want to go into as much detail now into what you should be keeping and what you should be throwing away now that we covered, your specific standards. For characters you have and you're building right now, I think you should always be looking at upgrading their pieces. So again, go for good main stats, then start upgrading their substats more and more, and only keeping the best pieces for your specific character. That being said, when you're trying to build new characters or maybe a new artifact set that you don't already have, I would recommend being a lot less picky. For example, this new Emblem of Severed Fate set that came out in patch 2.0, I don't have a good attack sans of it. My best one is this one, which considering my standards is honestly not that great, but I am keeping it and I will level this to +20 and use it on my emblem characters because it is the best that I have for this set. Now keep in mind it is +16, so it can still be better, but when you compare it to some of my other sans, it just really isn't a piece that I would normally be keeping unless I need the artifact set effect, which I do. Now, if you're afraid of throwing away a piece that might be good in the future, let's say a piece for a character that you're not using or someone that might come out that looks a bit different, like Kokomi, for example, what should you do? Well, let's talk about it. First of all, you can be a lot more picky if you don't have a character yet. If you're waiting for a new character, or if you're not sure what they're going to need, if you're like, maybe, I have this really good HP sans, maybe I should keep it for the future, right? Like this one, then you can be a lot more picky. Let's say you don't have Hu Tao, but you want her whenever she gets a rerun. Since you're going to have so much time to farm for that character, I would highly recommend being very picky with your substats and basically keeping like 1 HP Sands on set. So maybe a Crimson Witch of Flames, either Elemental Mastery or HP Sands for her, and effectively only keeping like 1 or 2 with whichever ones have the best substats. Personally, I know that I don't really use a lot of HP scaling characters and I already have decently good Sands. So I'm only going to keep HP Sands for future characters if they have both crit rate and crit damage on the substats. So I can clearly show you guys the difference between an artifact that I locked, which is a defense Sands with crit damage, crit rate, and elemental mastery, versus another defense Sands. I'm sure we'll find one. Yeah, like this one, which I'm obviously going to throw away because the substats are completely terrible. So all of these 5 stars that aren't locked, I can just easily throw away since I'm not going to keep them for like a future character if the substats are so bad. Whereas something like this might have potential in the future. So for now, I'm going to lock it because there might be a new defense scaling character, or it might only roll into crit when I level it. Now, another tip I can give you guys is actually to test the waters with a lot of artifacts. For example, something like this, right? Let's say you need an attack Sands. You might already have one, but let's say you might want an attack Sands. And it has 3 stats, one of them being a crit stat. While this piece looks bad, right? Crit rate is good, but flat defense and flat attack are terrible. It could actually be a really good piece if you level it to +4 and see that it gets crit damage, for example. Because of that, I highly recommend usually testing a lot of artifacts that have potential by leveling them to level 4. And yes, you lose a bit of artifact XP this way, but like see, we got energy recharge here, which means this might now be an artifact worth leveling. Granted, this really isn't the best example. This artifact isn't perfect, but I do recommend testing a lot of artifacts that may or may not be good depending on how they roll. The biggest example of this, and this is a tip that honestly I've never seen people talk about, at least from the videos that I've watched, is regarding circlets. Circlets have an immense amount of potential even if they look really bad at level 0. Now the reason for that is because the most important stat for a DPS character usually is crit rate and crit damage. On a circlet, since you're going for 1 on the main stat, the main substat you're looking for is the other form of crit. So for a crit rate circlet, you're looking for crit damage substat, and vice versa for a crit damage circlet. Because of that, a 3 substat crit circlet, which I literally have none of since I leveled them all to 4, can be amazing. This artifact, for example, could have only showed HP, elemental mastery, and energy recharge at level 0 since they're the first 3 substats. But then getting it +4 could have revealed this crit damage, making it a actually good circlet that's worth my time. That's why I level basically all of my crit circlets to level 4. You see this one had attack, defense, HP. I got it to +4 and it was unlucky, but there was a chance that it rolled crit rate, which would have made it amazing. In the same vein, I also think that can be applied to some goblets, especially depending on your substats and your current standards. Let's say a piece that might be something like, let's see if I have any locked. Yeah, like this one. I have a Pyro Goblet locked with crit rate and 2 other bad stats. This is something that for me, given my current Pyro Goblet standards, doesn't look particularly amazing, but if I were to get it to level 4, it might get crit damage on the last roll, and then I level it all the way and it just becomes amazing. A good example of this is one of my Pyro Goblets, and I feel bad like flexing in this video, but I do have a Pyro Goblet that started with only defense, crit damage, defense. I got it to +4, it got crit rate, and then it only rolled into crit, making it an amazing goblet, despite looking not that great at the start. Now I'm going to show you guys my inventory really quick. You'll see that there's actually a lot of circlets that are locked, a lot of just pieces in general that are locked. The reason for this is because I'm anticipating maybe future characters that might need specific sets. For example, a healing bonus circlet on maidens with 2 HP substats could be good if I want just like a pure healer on like Kokomi or any future character. Same thing with why I locked so many of these emblem flowers. Every single emblem flower I locked has at least 1 crit stat, right? Which means if I get it to +4, it might get the other one and immediately be amazing. This piece with EM, ER, crit damage, if the last stat it rolls is crit rate, will be honestly pretty perfect as long as it rolls into the good stats. Other than just substats, regarding specific main stats that I would keep for future characters, again, I do think having like 1 or 2 good main stats of every piece is probably recommended, especially if you're farming a lot of artifact domains. Let's say you get an elemental mastery piece that looks this good, right? Both crit stats and elemental mastery, and you don't need elemental mastery. I would still recommend locking it, or at least locking like 1 or 2 of them, you know, not every one you get, just in case you need it in the future since the substats are so good. Now, I did want to add that, first of all, basically any main stat you have, even if it's a bad main stat or something that you might not need on a current character, right? Like an attack goblet, which might be good on a future character, or, you know, a select few characters, even if you don't need it right now, if the substats are amazing, like crit rate and crit damage, and maybe you have 4 stats at level 0, it is something that I would almost always keep, even if the main stat is something that you don't need right now. Now, do keep in mind, I wouldn't start hoarding artifacts because artifact XP can be really hard. So if you do already have like, you know, 2 or 3 really good pieces of a specific element, a specific type, a specific specific main stat, and those are like 2 extra that you aren't currently using, I wouldn't necessarily keep hoarding them, and I would simply just get pickier and pickier with what you're looking for. Or maybe you can even give them 1 or 2 rolls, and then if they miss and just keep rolling defense or something, you can throw them away and move on. Generally speaking though, crit rate and crit damage, if they're together on basically any piece, I would keep, or if you have like a promising circlet, since circlets can be really hard. Also, one thing to keep in mind is that you actually keep a lot of artifact XP when you are basically throwing it away. So if you are testing an artifact by getting it to +4 and then you realize that you don't want it anymore, or if you're upgrading an artifact, you actually keep 80% of the XP, and it doesn't really cost you much more. As you can see, even a +21 will only cost me 3,780, and you will keep 80% of the artifact XP, which makes it a pretty good deal, especially if you're just checking like +4. You can put it back in and you'll still get like the next artifact +4 since you keep 80% of the XP. All right, so now I want to get into a very important section, and this is regarding specific artifact sets. Some specific artifact sets want specific stats and can require you to farm for specific pieces. Because of that, some pieces that might look bad can be really good if they are on a specific set, like Viridescent Venerer or like Noblesse Oblige, which we're going to talk about. So first of all, there are some support sets, once again, like the 4-piece Noblesse Oblige, that's used by a lot of healers. This set is amazing because it buffs all your party's attack, and so it's good on support characters like Bennett, like Diona, or potentially even like Kokomi. Because of that, it would be very smart while farming this domain to keep pieces that have stats like energy recharge or just support stats in general. This feather, for example, can look pretty bad if you're trying to build a DPS, but the 22% energy recharge is really good for my Bennett, who doesn't really need offensive stats and is mainly just used as a healer. Same thing with like Diona, and it would be even better if it had something like HP percent, since its scaling does scale off of that. Since it is a support set, as I mentioned, having energy recharge on like the Sands and even HP pieces, like an HP Sands for some healers like Diona, and the same thing for some circlets like healing bonus on this specific set can be good, so do keep that in mind when you're farming Noblesse Oblige, since yes, it can be an offensive set, but it can also be used for like healers and some support characters that might want different stats. Also, and I thought I should mention that for the quote-unquote bad artifact sets, you know, sets that you're not necessarily using, like Maidens, or for example Lava Walker, if you're not using that set on anyone, I still recommend keeping the ones that have really good substats because they can be used as an off piece. For example, since I've done so much Viridescent Venerer, I have a lot of Maidens pieces that I can use as offset pieces, and so I highly recommend keeping pieces on bad sets if the substats are amazing. But once again, you can be more picky with these pieces. On top of that, for your goblets, obviously, since it's usually the hardest piece to get a good main stat of, especially early game if you don't have a ton of like elemental goblets, they can really be from any set, since it's usually going to be your offset piece unless you get lucky and have a goblet on set. Next up, for the Blizzard Slayer set, this one is quite particular because it's usually used by cryo characters who want to freeze, right? So while the 2-piece set can just be, you know, cryo damage, the 4-piece set is really good in freeze comps because it gives you 40% crit rate when you're attacking frozen enemies. Because of that, and with cryo resonance also giving you some crit rate, generally speaking, cryo characters that want to build Blizzard Slayer don't need that much crit rate on their artifacts. My Ayaka, for example, is running a lot of pieces that just have a ton of crit damage but not a lot of crit rate. And so when you are running Blizzard Slayer, stats like crit damage and attack percent are really valuable, and even pieces with really low crit rate that might look bad on other sets can be very good on Blizzard Slayer since it is the main stat you're looking for. Crit damage and also attack percent, even for like a circlet, can be very good on the set because of how much crit rate you gain from the effect, and so you're mainly looking for like crit damage and attack percent. Next up, for the Viridescent Venerer set, when you're running support characters who are relying on their swirls damage, characters like Venti, characters like Kazuha, or even Sucrose, who can deal a lot of damage by constantly swirling enemies, and do remember that swirl got buffed in 1.6 to where it actually does a lot of damage. Elemental Mastery is a stat that is very needed on this set. Because of that, getting Elemental Mastery on the main stat of your Sands, Goblet, and Circlet are all super important for the Viridescent Venerer set. It's so good, and it's usually best in slot on characters like Sucrose, characters like Kazuha, and oftentimes also on Venti it can be really good, and it can even be good on like Sayu. So whenever you get Elemental Mastery main stats on Viridescent, I would lock them until you have enough for all the Anemo characters you use, and potentially maybe like saving one extra one if you need it, because they can be rare, and so throwing them away, especially if you don't have many, can really be a bad idea. On top of that, while it's hard to get Elemental Mastery main stat, the substats on these are really not that important. Like yes, for Kazuha you do still want crit, yes, for Sucrose energy recharge can be nice, but honestly once you have the main stats, especially for someone like Sucrose, it's basically all you need, honestly. On top of that, for sets like Crimson Witch of Flames, where you're really gonna be proccing rocking reactions nonstop, right? Like this is a set that increases your melt damage, your vaporize damage, your overload damage. It is a set where elemental mastery can be really nice because a lot of pyro characters that run Crimson Witch of Flames are going to oftentimes be vaporizing or even overloading, to where elemental mastery can be really good and one of the best substats. And also for the Emblem of Severed Fate set, since the 4-piece set transforms your energy recharge into some burst damage, or gives you some burst damage based on your energy recharge, it can be nice to have some ER on your substats, although keep in mind that an excessive amount of ER is still less damage than crit or attack percent or other substats that you might need, but having energy recharge on the set can always be nice. And I also wanted to, as a sort of last and bonus section, talk about artifact ratios, basically what you should be trying to achieve and why mine are so good, because I noticed a lot of people asking about this. Basically, you're looking for a 1-to-2 ratio of crit rate to crit damage, attack percent, and a lot of other stats are important too, but generally speaking, for a main DPS, when you start reaching the higher ranges of 60, 120, maybe up to 70, 140, right, crit rate to crit damage, that's when your character starts being like optimal and what I would call high investment. Now, do keep in mind that is off of your artifacts. There are crit weapons or ascension stats that can make your ratios inflated, but setting yourself the goal of getting like 50 crit rate, 100 damage, and then 60, 120, and then 70, 140 is always good. But there is a certain point where farming artifacts for a specific character becomes really hard and not really realistic to upgrade, to where you should move on to other characters. And so the ranges I told you are when your character starts becoming sort of optimal, which is like 60, 120, 70, 140 is a good place to be happy with. Now, that's not really the point of this video, but it is artifact related and I wanted to add it. And also, to the people wondering why my artifacts are so good, it is because my standards are so high. For example, I farmed Shao for so long that it's not really just me being lucky anymore. It's me having done so many Viridescent Veneer domain runs. Like, these are all the plus 21s that I have, that eventually I would get just better and better and better feathers to where I can min-max my pieces. So yeah, there's really a lot to cover in this video, and I was always really afraid of like not being too structured. So I hope it was easy to follow, and I hope you learned a lot through this video. If there's anything I want to add, it will be in a pinned comment, because again, there's a lot of artifact sets and there's just a lot of information that I had to cover. I hope this video was helpful and I hope you enjoyed. With that being said, that's pretty much it. I'm gonna go stream right now, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. As I mentioned in the intro, feel free to come watch me on Twitch, links in the description. Be sure to sub if this helped you out and if you're new, because it does mean a lot. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.